What we have here is a scale model of Noah's Ark. It is built to an HO scale, which is one of the standard scales for model trains and so forth. To give you what that scale is, that is 181, 1 to 81. So basically 1 inch on this would be equivalent to 81 inches in real life. Now this model is around 5 feet long. It's a little bit more than 5 feet. The way I got the dimensions for this was I just used the dimensions given for the ark in the Bible. You can find a description of the ark in Genesis 6. Starting in verse 15. This is when God was speaking to Noah, and we'll talk a little bit more in just a moment about what God was telling Noah. But among the things, God said this is how you are to make it, the ark. The length of the ark, 300 cubits. Its breadth, 50 cubits. And its height, 30 cubits. Now, a cubit is typically interpreted as being the length from a person's forefinger, the tip of the finger, to the elbow. Okay? That's a cubit right there. The standard cubit is considered to have been 18 inches long, so 1.5 feet. If we use the standard cubit to get our measurements in feet, the ark would then be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. The purpose of a scale model like this is to show just how big that would be, to give an idea of how big it would be in real life. Everything down here is also to an HO scale. The goats, the human, these are ibexes. These are all to the same scale as the ark. So it does give us a good idea of just how large the ark would be compared to a human. Now I do want to mention that there were actually different standards of cubits in the past. For example, there was the royal cubit, which was actually closer to 21 inches. Some people have created models of the ark based on the royal cubit rather than the standard cubit, and they get an ark that would be over 500 feet long. I'm sticking with the standard cubit here because while it might be a little on the short side compared to its actual length, it still shows you how impressive the ark would be in size and scale. And understanding how large the ark was in size and scale is important because there are some people who are very critical of the ark. They want to say that the ark wasn't large enough. Wasn't large enough for what? Well, let's talk about what the ark was for, okay? We mentioned in Genesis 6 when God gave the instruction, some of the description of the ark for Noah to build. Let's go back to Genesis 6. And now we're going to start up in verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits. Its breadth, 50 cubits. And its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it a cubit above. And set the door of the ark inside. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. We're going to come back to that phrase. The all flesh in which is the breath of life under heaven. We're going to come back to that because that's going to become important later too. But, God continues, I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing on the ground according to its kind, 2 of every sort shall come into you to keep them alive. Also take with you every sort of food that is eaten and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Now, I know that was a long passage, but there's a lot of important information right there, talking about the purpose of the ark and answering some of the criticisms about the ark. Okay? So the purpose of the ark was to provide a way for Noah, his family, and 2 of every kind of animal to survive the flood. Why was the flood coming? The flood was coming as a punishment upon mankind because they had become corrupted. They had turned away from God and were living in disobedience to him. And so that was God's way of punishing them, wiping the earth clean, if you will, and starting over in a manner of speaking. So we know that the ark had to be big enough to hold 2 of every kind of animal. Now this is where the first criticism comes in. Some people will say, there's not enough room here to hold 2 of every kind of animal. You just can't possibly do it. Well, let's talk a little bit about the volume of the ark. Just how big was it? How many animals could it hold in theory? Well, to help with that, this stock car is also HO scale. So this is how big a stock car would be compared to an ark, the ark, okay? Looking at a comparison in volume, you could fit 522 railroad stock cars like this in the ark. If you were able to fit 240 sheep in a stock car like this, you would be able to fit 125,000 sheep on the ark. That's a lot of sheep. That would be packed very tightly, but you could fit that many. 125,000 sheep could fit on the ark. That's not a theoretical thing. That's using a comparison of what we use today to transport livestock. Okay? Keep that number in mind. That's going to become important again later. But some people will say, but there are millions of species of animals. How in the world are you going to fit millions, 2 of every millions of species of animals on the ark if you can only fit 125,000 sheep on it? There's no way you can do that. Well, let's go back and see what the Bible says. If we go back to Genesis 6, we read this part already, but I want to reiterate this part again. In verse 17, God says, "For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die." So for one thing, we don't need to take on board the ark all of the water-dwelling animals. Fish, crustaceans, other animals that live exclusively in the water would not have to go on the ark. It was the things on the earth, on the dry land, that was going to be destroyed. So that cuts off a number of species that would not have to come onto the ark. There's a little bit more. Notice what is said here. Again, in verse 17. "All flesh in which is the breath of life." Now, chapter 7 of Genesis gives us a little bit more description of what God is talking about here. When it's talking about the flood and talking about the destruction of the flood, it says in verse 21, "And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land," again, it wasn't things in the water. We don't have to worry about those species. "Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died." And what's the significance of that? Not every land-dwelling animal breathes through its nostrils. The insects, for example, they do breathe air, but they don't use nostrils. They breathe through spiracles in the sides of their abdomen. Arachnids, spiders and scorpions and stuff, they don't have nostrils either. They have a structure called book lungs. So if we limit the animals that went onto the ark to creatures that lived on land and that breathed through nostrils, we actually cut out much of the species of animals that we know today. And to give you an example of that, do you want to know what is the single most diverse group of animals today? Those are the arthropods. The arthropods includes the insects, the crustaceans, the arachnids, and all those sorts of things. Everything like them, the millipedes, the centipedes, and so forth. They alone constitute around 90% of known species of animals. We would not have to count any of those because some of them live in the water, none of them have the breath of life in their nostrils. We would not have to count even 90% of the species of animals as going on the ark. Okay? So that's the first thing we need to know. We need to know what type of animals were brought onto the ark. And the Bible is very specific about that. Okay? Here's the second thing we need to know. The Bible does not tell us that God took species of animals on the ark. That Noah took species of animals on the ark, excuse me. It says we were told that God sent kinds of animals, the birds after their kind, creeping creatures according to the kind, and so forth. So what's a kind? Well, it is believed that a kind represents a group of organisms that are capable of interbreeding with one another. If we look back in the Genesis account, if we look back in Genesis 1 to the creation week, God repeatedly said that he created the plants after their kind, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea after their kind, and so on. We get a hint as to what a kind is when he describes the creation of plants. I'm going to turn to Genesis 1 and read this passage specifically. So this is the third day. God has created the plants. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. The interesting thing there is that twice in those verses, the emphasis of kinds is on a seed. Why is that significant? Seeds come about because of reproduction. The implication is that members of the same kind are capable of interbreeding with one another. And if that's the case, then kinds are not the same thing as species. Species are actually much more exclusive than kinds are. Species is a smaller group of animals than a kind. And to give a quick example of that, a classic example of a hybrid animal is a mule. A father who is a donkey, a mother who is a horse, they can interbreed and they produce a mule. Donkeys and horses belong to separate species. But because they're able to interbreed, they belong to the same kind. And therefore, Noah would not be taking donkeys and horses on board the ark. He would just take one representative of the kind of horses. Okay? And that kind likely included zebras as well. They are known to interbreed with both horses and donkeys. And so if we understand kinds, then we don't have to worry about species, and the number of species decreases to numbers of kinds. Now, we're not entirely sure exactly how many species are in a particular, how many species of animals are in a particular kind. It's generally thought that in our modern classification of animals, that the family is the closest to a kind. So if we count families of animals, the number of animals decreases quite significantly. And we are no longer looking at hundreds of thousands of species. We're actually just looking at hundreds of thousands of kinds. Okay? Now, there's been some studies on this to count the number of animal kinds, both living and extinct. I will emphasize this, and this will become apparent in just a little bit, but if we take the Bible for what it says, we believe that even animals that are extinct today would have been on the ark. Everything in whose nostrils was the breath of life and that lived on land came on board the ark. So anything that was alive during the time of Noah went on board the ark. If we accept that the majority of the fossil record was created by the flood, and it does appear that that is the case because the flood was a very destructive event, that created conditions for burying large numbers of animals, then everything that we find fossils of today and everything alive today would both go on the ark. But if we count all the known families, both of animals alive today and animals that are known from the fossils, and we limit the families to only those creatures that would have breathed through their nostrils and lived on board and lived on land, you only have about 15,000 kinds. Now, we have to double that because there would have been 2 of every kind. So there would have been around 30,000 animals on board the ark. Remember how many sheep can be on the ark? 125,000. So it's quite a much smaller number of animals that were actually required to be on the ark compared to the total capacity of the ark. Now, this leads to another question. Oh, some of those animals are just way too big. Think of all of the big animals today, such as an elephant or a giraffe. Surely they wouldn't be able to fit on the ark, not comfortably. Well, I don't know. These are both to the same scale. You think they could fit on the ark well enough? So we don't really have a problem fitting big animals on the ark, do we? But you said, you were very specific, that even the extinct animals went on board the ark. Surely the big dinosaurs couldn't have gone on the ark, right? This one's Brachiosaurus. Not the largest dinosaur, but close. Big enough, I should say. This one is actually slightly out of scale. It's slightly larger than it would have been in proportion to the ark. Nevertheless, it's still a good illustration that, yes, indeed, some of the dinosaurs did get very big. And compared to the ark, they would have been too big, even. I'll admit that. Some of the dinosaurs would have been too big on the ark to get on the ark. But not all of them were. This is Brachiosaurus. This is Europasaurus. Now, it's a little deceiving because of how long he is, but do understand that the body, the size of Europasaurus would have been close to that of a large ox. Something smaller than an elephant. Would this have fit on the ark? Well, quite easily. There's a good possibility that these two belong to the same family, in which case they could have belonged to the same kind. And if Noah only had to take 2 of a kind on the ark, he didn't have to take the biggest members of the kind. He could have taken the smaller ones, or even the mid-sized ones. Point is, if we take kinds into account once more, we don't have to take the biggest members. We can take the smaller ones and make them fit better. There's even more. Here's a couple of Tyrannosaurs. And again, they're slightly out of scale. They're a little bit bigger than they would actually be compared to the ark, but it's close. 2 Tyrannosaurs. What's the difference between them? Age. This one here is based on an old specimen of Tyrannosaurus rex, and it would have been maximum size. This one here is based on what would be best described as a teenage Tyrannosaurus rex. About half the length, much smaller than the big one here. Something like this is probably close to sexual maturity. It would have been close to being able to reproduce and producing offspring on its own. Why would Noah want to bring the older ones on board the ark when he could just as easily bring the younger ones close to maturity? Younger ones that were more vibrant and would be able to repopulate the world more easily. And if he took the younger ones, he would be saving space because he wouldn't be taking the very big ones on the ark. So, if we take all of this into account, if we take into account taking on board the smaller members of the kind rather than the big ones, if we take into account taking the young ones rather than the old ones, we would actually have more room on the ark that way. If you go and look at the different kinds of animals, the different families of animals, and look at the average size of each of those animals. Do you know what is the average size of land-dwelling, air-breathing animals that would have to go on Noah's Ark? Do you know what the average size of those animals is? It's the size of a rat. And that might seem surprising. When we think of animals, we always think of the big ones, don't we? We always think of the elephants, the big cats, lions and tigers. We think of bears and things like that. Why? Well, these are impressive animals. They're ones that we're afraid of. They're ones that we find imposing. And so they're ones that stick in our minds. But think of how many different animals there are that are small. Think of all the different types of rodents that there are. Those are all the size of a rat or smaller. Think of the insectivores, the shrews, the moles, and so forth. Think of the various types of marsupials that are all small. If you go and look at the average of all the different types of animals, you'll find that the smaller animals are actually more diverse. And if we average it all out, the average size of an animal alive today that would have to be on Noah's Ark is the size of a rat. But the dinosaurs were so big. Well, some of the things goes for the dinosaurs as well. Sure, we pay attention to the really big ones because they're imposing and they're awesome, right? But you should all know, this is by no means the standard size for a dinosaur. There were many dinosaurs that were quite smaller. 6 foot or less even. In length. Keep in mind that with their long tails and their straight backs and even their long necks, I'm not talking about sauropods specifically, but many dinosaurs had relatively long necks. Their weight and the space that they would occupy would be actually pretty small compared to their length. So 6 feet long would actually be small for a dinosaur. And there were many that were that length or smaller. If you take the average size of dinosaurs, you're still only about an equivalent size of a sheep. So let's scale things up for us. Let's scale things up and say that the average size of an animal that had to go on Noah's Ark was the size of a sheep. What did we say earlier? About 30,000 animals on the Ark. And the Ark has a capacity of 125,000 sheep. We are not even occupying half the space of the Ark with 30,000 sheep. You can fit all the animals on the Ark and have space left over for living quarters for the humans, for all the store of food that they would require, and the water and all that sort of stuff. It's very feasible. It is very feasible that all the animals could fit on the Ark quite comfortably. All right, I do want to end with this. Some of the information I'm giving you is rather straightforward. You can just look in the Bible and read about the dimensions of the Ark and that sort of stuff. Read what kinds of animals Noah was instructed to bring on the Ark. Some of that's just straightforward and very simple. You can find it easily. Some of the information I got came from this book here, Noah's Ark, a feasibility study. And it goes through some of the numbers I talked about. How many families of animals were there? What was the average size of the animal that would have been on the Ark and so forth? So I would recommend this as a resource if you were curious to know where some of my information came from. But I just wanted to close out with this. Based on the capacity of the Ark, there's no reason to consider the flood account as fictitious. It actually makes sense. It would work. And so, we can take the account of Genesis account of the flood and Noah's Ark seriously. And just as God sent the flood or judgment back then because of the corruption of the earth at the time, the corruption of mankind on the earth. But he sent the flood as punishment. But God was merciful to Noah and his family, giving Noah the instructions for building an ark and making a way for them to be saved from the coming punishment. There is still going to be a coming punishment. People are still wicked today, are they not? I think we would all agree that there are many wicked people in the world. So sin is still a problem. And there's still going to be a judgment. It's not going to be by a flood anymore. God promised not to flood the earth again. But there will be a judgment. And just as in Noah's time, God created a way to escape the coming judgment. The way of escape of the coming judgment is through the death and resurrection of his Son, who died in our place for our sins, so that we can be saved through faith in him. And in that way, the ark is actually a picture of the gospel, in the sense that it was a way of salvation. The method of salvation today is very different. We can't survive the coming judgment with a physical ark that we can build with our own hands. Instead, we have to rely on the grace and mercy of God provided to us through the death and resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ.